Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us online from wherever you may be joining today. My name is Alita Johnston, and I'm the Communications Manager for the International Science Council Regional Focal Point for Asia and the Pacific, which is led by the Australian Academy of Science and funded by the Australian Government. We're delighted to be hosting today's social media training session on content creation for scientific research. It's the third of six social media modules we are providing for our members, affiliates and friends, and it's the last one for this year. The session will return again in March next year, and we'll drop links in the chat to the recordings for the previous sessions. Captions and translated captions are available for this meeting. The details for how to access them will be in the chat. And if you haven't done so already, please consider renaming yourself to include your full name and the organisation that you're representing so we know who we're talking to. Today's session is presented by James Fitzgerald, who is the Program Director for Global EdTech Business SMK, or Social Media Knowledge. James is a social media industry expert with a wealth of knowledge in educating decision makers, leaders and their teams in making the most of their digital communications. We also have some special guest scientists who have kindly agreed to join us for the Q&A session at the end. Dr. Mamita Kohli is a consultant on the International Science Council's Future of Scientific Publishing project and a science, tech and innovation policy researcher. And Dr. Ru Somawira is the lead for ecology at Stantec Australia, an adjunct associate professor at Murdoch University, a National Geographic explorer and author who is dedicated to popularising science for a broader audience. I've followed Ru's social media for many years, and I encourage you to take a look at his web and social media pages. My colleague, Siraj Barazgai, from the International Science Council office in Paris, has kindly joined us very early in his day to assist me behind the scenes with the technical run of show. And thank you to those who have provided questions in advance. Please put any other questions in the chat as you go, and we'll try to answer them during or after the session. I'd now like to hand over to James Fitzgerald to get the training session underway. Thanks, James.
Thanks very much, Alita, and welcome everyone to today's session. As Alita mentioned, this is the third in a series, obviously, of six that we're delivering, and the final one for 2024. The focus area for today is around content and communications. And with today's session, let me just share my slides so we can get underway. The focus for today is really around, I suppose, being able to produce consistently good quality content and communications at scale to support your either personal or organizational aims. Now, in today's session, we're going to be looking at this from a variety, I suppose, of different perspectives. So when we think about content marketing and communications, what we really want to be able to do is to tell interesting stories about the work that we're doing, and also to highlight, areas of priority for our work, or potentially for our stakeholders. So with that in mind, in today's session, we're going to be thinking about a bit of a recap on some of the strategic considerations in creating a good content marketing plan. And then also starting to think around, particularly in the context of social media, how social media algorithms work, how they've changed recently, and how you can bring your content to life and sort of lean into storytelling to bring your kind of projects to life. So let's get into it. We will stop for a quiz around about halfway through, give or take. So we've got about sort of 60 minutes-ish of content that I'll be delivering with a quiz in the middle. And then we've obviously got the Q&A with two of our guests, as Alita mentioned, towards the end of the session. So let's get started. So when we think about content marketing, I think it's important to be clear on what content marketing is and is not. There's a lot of organizations and individuals which spend time throughout the month or throughout the year trying to produce content, which they distribute across a range of different sort of audience touch points. But I think, you know, if we're trying to create real long-term value with our content, and again, that's been a theme in some of our existing modules we've delivered so far, it's important to approach content in a strategic way. And I think in order to build the right audience and to retain that audience's attention for the long haul, which is kind of really what we want, it's ultimately about consistently being able to produce valuable, relevant content, which is not overly self-serving. A lot of the times, you know, if all we're producing is content that makes us look great and makes us feel great, but it doesn't really add any value for the end user, you know, even if you pique someone's curiosity with one post, the next 5 that you do will probably put them off. So I think fundamentally the key to building an engaged audience for your content, and the key for you to, I suppose, retain the attention of your kind of key stakeholders, is really probably more about them than it is about you. And I think it's also important to kind of really kind of latch on to this idea of value. You know, if you produce valuable information that resonates with your desired target audience, and you do that 52 weeks a year, year after year, you know, you will be seen as an expert in your field. You will kind of reach audiences that you can't typically reach. But ultimately, it all comes down to this idea of creating value. Now, content marketing, you know, whether we're doing it as individual academics or whether we're doing it as institutions, there's a lot to like about content marketing. You know, if you are able to consistently produce valuable content week after week, month after month, year after year, you know, it has a great job. It does a great job in terms of building your awareness, and also, you know, depending on what outcomes you might want to be achieving, it can also drive and boost conversion rates as well. And I think what's important to note with content marketing, it's not one of these things that's going to give you a quick win. So for argument's sake, if you rush out tomorrow and go and start producing lots of, you know, snappy little interesting videos around your area of expertise, you know, if you do that for 3 weeks and then kind of don't do anything for 3 months, and then do another couple, and then don't do anything for 2 months, and then, you know, do 10 and then do nothing for, you know, for half a year, it's not really going to achieve anything. You know, it's consistently showing up week after week, or whatever cadence you can commit to, but it's really about kind of committing to the work and sort of putting in the effort on a recurring, ongoing basis. And if you can do that, well, over the medium to long term, the payback and the value you get from that it is really quite significant. But a very kind of piecemeal, kind of bitty, inconsistent approach doesn't really deliver a huge amount. And like I said, in the short term, it can sometimes feel like quite a lot of effort and quite a lot of work. I dare say you're all busy as it is. But if you can kind of commit to a frequency and a kind of a cadence of content that you can maintain, and then you sustain that over time, over the longer period of time, it really does kind of pay off. And, you know, just to give you some, I suppose, some practical context, in our business, we've invested in content marketing for the best part of, you know, nearly 15 years. And ours comes to life across a variety of different channels and touch points. And this is quite important, I think, because a lot of people think that content marketing just means posting on Instagram or WeChat or LinkedIn or wherever it may be. A good content marketing plan is kind of multi-channel. So just to give you an example how we do this in our business, and then we can kind of tie this back, you know, to institutions and scientists afterwards. So in our business, everything centers on our blog, which lives on our website. So each week and we've only got a small team, by the way. We have quite a small internal team here at SMK, despite appearances. But each week we produce 3 articles, which are long form in style. So they're about 1,000 words each. And that's really the kind of focal point of everything that we do. And I think if we're smart about the way we produce our content, you know, what we should be really aiming for is some economies of scale, where I make one thing, but then I get 5 things out of it. That to me is really where content marketing can come into its own. So again, just to recap, in our business, it all kind of starts around these long form articles on our website. And then those articles are then translated into email newsletters. And we send out 3 email newsletters a week, which go out on a Monday and Wednesday and Friday to about 30,000 email subscribers who have opted in to receive that communication. With the newsletters that go out each week, which we send out on a Monday and Wednesday and Friday, we don't necessarily send every newsletter to every person within the database. So what we actually do, and this is probably more relevant for institutions than individual scientists, but what we actually do is, depending on how engaged someone is by SMK, that really determines the frequency that we will contact them. So, for example, if someone hasn't really been to our website for, say, 6 months, or hasn't really read an article of ours for 6 months, we might only contact them once a fortnight. So, again, for institutions and even individuals, if you're keen, it's not that difficult to calibrate your contact frequency in line with obviously the interest signals that you might be getting from your audience and your end users. Now, those articles that go on our website will also fuel our kind of unpaid social activity via our Facebook page, via LinkedIn as well. So that's content that feeds that content we share on a weekly basis organically. And it then also ties in with the advertising that we run as well. So to use kind of marketing parlance, we would say, look, at SMK, we produce 3 unique proprietary pieces of content each week. And then that content is amplified across our earned, owned, and paid media channels. So owned media is media that you own. So that would be like your blog or a website or an email list that you might send out kind of communications to. Earned media is the kind of organic posting that you might do on LinkedIn or WeChat or Facebook on a week-to-week basis. And then paid media is well, as the name suggests, that's kind of advertising. So a good approach to content marketing will see us producing valuable content, which our audience is either educated by or entertained by. And then that content really should be amplified across a range of touch points, not just shared in one social network. I mean, you can share it just in one social network if you want. But even for an individual scientist, having a presence on more than one social network, if you're keen to do that, is quite advantageous. And then similarly, having a website where content lives and then having an email list that you can send out email communications to is also quite beneficial, even for an individual scientist as well. So an institution should be amplifying content across earned, owned, and paid media. But for an individual scientist, earned and owned media, I think is equally fine and very, very doable as well. And that's really when you get the best return on investment for your effort and your energy. Because if we're just producing content for, say, LinkedIn or for Twitter or for whatever platform we want to use, your content kind of is kind of at the whims of that platform. And as we'll talk about later, algorithms change. So again, we want to be in a position where, we're thinking sort of more longer term and investing in a very minimum earned and owned media, and ideally for an institution, earned, owned, and paid media. Now, with content marketing, like we said, there's a lot to like about content marketing, both for individuals and for institutions. But I think it's important to also be realistic about some of the challenges within content marketing as well. It's not all, sunshine and rainbows. With content marketing, it's hard. Being able to produce good quality content at scale, 12 months a year, is not easy. It's a difficult thing to do. Because also, if we think about it, attention is very much a zero-sum game. So if you're reading my emails, you're not reading someone else's emails. Similarly, if you're watching my videos on YouTube, you're not watching someone else's videos on YouTube. So again, competition is fierce. And again, if you find it difficult, don't worry, it is difficult. And I think it's important to be realistic about that. Again, rather than going into it with false expectations. I mean, speaking of competition, across the Meta family of apps, which obviously dominates social media, so that's obviously Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger, there's over 200 million organizations on there. And, the best part of probably 50 to 100 million sort of creators or influencers. So why should someone follow you? Why should someone read your posts? Why should someone watch your videos? again, we're competing with a very high standard of content. And I think it's important to, not have a false expectation that people are desperate to hear from us. So again, I think it's important to be realistic about the challenge at hand. Also, when we think about quality, the quality threshold now for content is quite high, particularly in environments like, say, TikTok, where we see kind of, scientific kind of little sound bites or snippets or things like reels, or myth busting, or, people showcasing the latest research. Like, the quality of content being produced at scale now is quite high. I think once upon a time, as a scientist or an institution, if you just made content, there was a good chance you'd get decent kind of exposure. But nowadays, content is a commodity. So being able to actually produce content that actually attracts and retains attention is quite challenging. And again, I think really when we think about I suppose when we think about furthering your individual or organizational aims, we've got to be thinking not only in terms of getting in front of the people that we need to get in front of, but we need to also think as well about earning their attention. So much so, in fact, we might say, well, as we've spoken about in previous modules when we've looked at strategy, whose attention do I need? Whose attention do I want? And what's the kind of level that I'm going to need to get to in order to kind of be the dominant force within that person's feed or email inbox potentially. Now, when we think about the difference between kind of individual scientists and institutions, in our last module, module 2, where we looked at developing strategy, I'll just recap on some of the things that we spoke about, because we did touch on, content and some considerations in that module. So generally speaking, for an individual scientist or academic or researcher, normally the objective is either around, building a personal brand, establishing themselves as an authority figure within their field, or just, furthering the greater good, obviously, in science. So on that basis, then, there are some quite specific tangible outcomes that we'd be wanting to achieve to kind of demonstrate that. And as such, as we spoke about in module 2, there are ways and means which we can kind of measure and benchmark that to see if we're actually making progress. In terms of the target audiences that you would have, obviously, as an individual scientist, again, more often than not, the primary audience is probably going to be in industry, whether that be obviously fellow scientists, researchers, or professionals in the field for the purposes of gaining grants or fundings. But again, beyond that, there might be a secondary audience as well, which could be the general public. And again, it obviously depends a little bit on what your focus is. For some people, what is on the slide as the secondary audience could well actually be your primary audience. So again, like I said, this is not a definitive outline of what a content marketing plan needs to look like. It's just an example. Also, I think if you are developing or intending to develop your own content marketing plan, you could perhaps use this as a bit of a blueprint and a template. Now, again, scaling quality content isn't easy. So I think what's going to make life a lot easier is having some structure around what it is you're actually going to create content around. What you don't want to do is be in a situation where every week you're having to decide, what should I make this week, or what should I talk about? If you're not sure what to talk about, that would normally be evidence that you haven't really thought through a plan. And in fact, you probably don't have a strategy. If you're running out of things to say, or your content lacks freshness and is repetitive, that's usually your signal that, again, we might want to maybe take a step back, maybe calibrate some of our thinking. And again, like I said, maybe perhaps go again, with a more sustainable, scalable approach. Now, one of the things we touched upon in the Q&A in another session that we've delivered in the last few months is it's a lot easier for us to create content at scale, if we say have one idea, and then from that idea, I'll go and produce potentially several different things. And in fact, we did talk about this in quite a bit of detail actually in module 2. So have a think about the different formats at your disposal. So if we scoot back just to maybe something like, personal insights and stories, your personal insights and stories could potentially come to life across all of these different formats here. So rather than us thinking, okay, to make 5 pieces of content, I need 5 ideas. Often it's more economical to say, okay, I've got one idea. I'm going to bring that to life in 5 formats. That gives me 5 pieces. So one idea in multiple formats rather than one idea in one format is a much more scalable way to produce your content. Now, tactically speaking, in terms of building a personal brand, and in order to acquire and retain the attention of whoever you need, like we said, we've got to show up semi-regularly. As a general rule of thumb, provided you've got valuable things to say, the more you're capable of posting, probably the better. That said, if you don't really have anything to talk about, producing 2-3 pieces a week is probably not going to be a great use of anyone's time. But that said, if you don't have anything to talk about, that to me is indicative that we probably need to work a little bit more on our strategy, because if we've got a good plan in place where we've got our kind of content pillars, as it were, identified, then we shouldn't find it too challenging or too taxing to produce at a decent rate and a decent cadence. In terms of where you should do it, like we've spoken about in earlier modules in this course, I think for an individual scientist, it naturally makes sense, I think, to really prioritize platforms that you enjoy and platforms that you like personally, rather than going into environments where you don't feel comfortable or you don't really enjoy them. Because I think if you're not really liking where you're sort of distributing your content, the probability of you doing it 2 years from today is probably quite slim. So I think in terms of the channels, I think for an individual scientist, again, it makes sense to, by all means, focus on social media that you enjoy, and then potentially kind of dovetail that with a dedicated website or blog, whereby you're also giving people the opportunity to sign up for regular email updates as well. And again, the email frequency could be, once a month or once a quarter or something like that. But certainly as far as social media goes, I think you should really focus on things that you enjoy, because I think if you don't enjoy them, again, it's going to be quite a struggle for you to maintain consistency. I think when it comes to institutions, obviously the focus for institutions is probably going to be quite different. And again, we did talk about this in our kind of strategy presentation in module 2. But again, just to recap, for an institution will have a range of organizational aims that it's trying to achieve. And as such, it could end up with a variety of different content outlets. So it's not unusual, for example, for a university to have 20, 30, 40, social media profiles. That's not unusual by any means, depending on the size of the university and depending how decentralized it is. So I think for an institution, the goals are usually quite varied, because again, they're quite complex organizations. If we have a look at someone like the Australian Academy of Science, or a university, or even the International Science Council, there's quite a lot of things that it would want to achieve with its content. And I think as such, it will probably have a variety of different target audiences and stakeholders for that content as well. So for institutions, content marketing plans can end up being quite sizable, and have a variety of different kind of touch points and outlets kind of woven throughout them. Again, in terms of what they'll produce, there'll be some similarities with what obviously a scientist will produce. But again, given the diverse range of organizational aims that an institution will have, it won't be exactly the same kind of content. It will probably be a little bit more macro in nature. But again, you can see that there is a certain level of crossover and similarity between them. But again, you could almost argue that, the institution has more of a macro focus and the individual has more of a micro focus. Again, given that kind of higher level focus. Whatever would take place on the content front is naturally going to need to kind of be aligned with and overlap with its corporate communications and potentially advertising as well. So again, there's probably other strategic plans that the content piece has to kind of weave in with. And, you know, even in terms of the aesthetic and the look and feel in the content, you know, it will probably be a little less colloquial, you know, perhaps a little less amateurish in the look and feel. And again, the tone will obviously be quite different as well. Unlike with a individual scientist, an institution is probably going to need to be present in all the major channels, in all the major regions and markets where it plays. And as we mentioned, it may well have multiple presences within some of those channels to cater for different stakeholders. Again, you know, if we look at something like Facebook, which is the most widely used platform in the world by institutions, with something like Facebook, you know, it's not unusual for an institution to have, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 Facebook accounts, which are set up for different parts of the organization. So again, you know, the fundamentals are similar, but the scale of operation is obviously going to be quite different. And the need to overlap with existing corporate communications plans and advertising and other, you know, public affairs potentially activity is obviously going to add a layer of complexity to obviously that operation. Now, whether you're creating content as an individual scientist or an institution, one of the biggest developments in recent times has been the rise of short form video. And the rise of short form video, which was really popularized first by TikTok in the West, it's probably both, you know, a blessing and a curse, I think, in science communication. According to Meta, which is obviously, you know, the parent company for Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger, and the biggest player in social media, according to Meta, 82% of all the media consumed this year will be video, and just over half of that will be short form video. So for both individuals and for institutions alike, a video first approach to content marketing is increasingly a requirement. Specifically, you know, if you're sharing content in social networks, whether it be advertising or organic, again, the rise of video has been quite substantial over the last few years. So I think in the new year, in March, our next module is specifically looking at video. So this will be a subject that we expand on in a lot of detail in 2025. But I think navigating a move towards a video first approach to content is probably going to be one of the kind of key things to work on for 2025. Now, like we said, this shift in focus to video, specifically short form video, is entirely been catalyzed by the rise of TikTok. When we look at video in social networks, video has been available in social media for quite a number of years. But the growth in popularity of TikTok over the last few years has really bumped video to a whole new level. And as a result of that, I think every single platform nowadays has video solutions in market and are all scaling up their video offerings very, very quickly. According to TikTok's own data, not only is it a popular app, but people spend a tremendous amount of time there per person per day. So according to TikTok's own data, average time spent there per person per day is about 90 minutes. For comparison, the average time spent on Facebook and Instagram per person per day is probably about 75 to 80 minutes. So you can understand why platforms like Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and other platforms, you can understand why they're kind of gradually going through this TikTokification process, because not only do people spend, you know, a significant amount of time there each day, but your average user opens the app 19 times a day. Now, considering there isn't really a messaging offering in TikTok, that's pretty extraordinary that people feel the need to open it, you know, probably more than once or twice an hour every hour of being awake. Recently, Scott Galloway, who is an academic and a business and technology commentator in the US, did a really interesting analysis of TikTok's business. And one of the things he was saying is, look, when you look at TikTok and you compare it to other social network, you're completely getting it wrong. You know, TikTok isn't actually a social network at all. It's an entertainment app. And when we compare TikTok to other popular entertainment apps, it provides a much better perspective on the power that the platform has. And one of the comparisons he drew was between TikTok and Netflix. And again, in 2021, and this number would be much higher now, by the way, but in 2021, if you kind of totaled up all of the time spent on TikTok, you know, you're looking at probably a good, well, nowadays, probably a good 3 to 4 times more time spent on TikTok than the likes of Netflix, which I think we can all agree is a big deal. So the rise of TikTok has been hugely disruptive in terms of online communication. And what we're now seeing as a result of that is all of the kind of major digital channels, like I said, are kind of going through this kind of process of obviously playing catch up. Now, obviously, it's slightly different in China because obviously TikTok's parent company, obviously ByteDance, it's obviously Chinese version of TikTok Douyin is very, very similar. And again, the whole kind of short form videos piece is probably more further along in sort of Chinese apps than it has been in Western apps. But certainly we've seen this kind of real shift in focus in the last few years where we see video taking over as the preferred format. So much so, in fact, a few years ago, Adam Mosseri, who's the head of Instagram, actually came out and said that Instagram isn't a photography app. And at the time caused quite a bit of friction amongst its user base as it looked to actually reinvent and reimagine itself as something very, very different. So all the major players, like I said, have gone about launching their own form of video in some way, shape, or form. And as such, both for institutions and for scientists as well, you know, if we are going to be thinking about, you know, telling stories around our research or our projects or our programs, again, doing that via video, I think is absolutely essential in 2025. The growth of video is pretty well documented from the user point of view, but from kind of organizations, uptake has obviously been a little bit slower, in large part due to the fact that scaling video is quite hard. So let's say that you currently do maybe, you know, 1 video a week. Well, going from 1 video a week to 1 video a day for many of us is quite challenging. So although Instagram Reels and Facebook Reels and YouTube Shorts and all of these different video solutions are popular with users, for kind of probably academics and for institutions alike, moving to a video first approach is certainly something which is requires thought. And again, so much so, we've got a whole module focused on it, which we'll obviously be delivering in March. The move to mimic TikTok, like I said, is something which has impacted every single channel and touch point. Even music apps like Spotify now actually have their own kind of video offering as well, which again is a fledgling offering nonetheless. But we're seeing this total reimagining of online communications built around short form video as everyone looks to mimic, obviously, TikTok. Even recently, LinkedIn announced there was a story in the national media in Australia actually earlier on this week, where the number of chief executives and executive influencers on LinkedIn is absolutely booming. Over the last 12 months, there's been a 23% increase in CEO posts, and again, a huge upswing and surge in video. So even in very corporate environments, and even for very corporate communicators, this move to, you know, particularly favoring short form video is very, very real. So I think for senior academics, for junior academics, for institutions, and kind of everyone in between, again, making that move over to video is certainly something which needs to be probably a priority for 2025. When we think about content, like I said, I think whether we are operating at an organizational level or an individual level, obviously there's been a big shift in emphasis towards video in recent times. But I think it's important to note that it's not only video which does well. And I think nowadays, for for social networks, and we'll talk about how algorithms work in a bit more detail shortly. But for social networks, really what they seem to be favoring is any kind of content that has a high amount of dwell time that people spend on it, or a high level of interactivity, or preferably probably both. So, for example, if you look at a platform like Instagram, recently Amplify, which is a analytics company, did a study of the best performing content formats on Instagram, and basically found that the best performing content by quite a significant margin was carousels and reels. Now, again, carousels, you might think, well, aren't they just photos? Well, firstly, carousels can be either photos or videos. And again, carousels come to life in different ways in different platforms. But one of the good things about providing a carousel is a carousel obviously drives interactivity as people kind of swipe through the things that are in it. But one of the other things about carousels as well is algorithmically, if you've got, maybe 4 or 5 pictures or videos in a carousel, often you get added exposure within people's feeds because, again, it will shuffle through other images or other assets within the carousel itself. So I think if you do find it difficult to create a lot of video and photography is a bit easier, again, do think about maybe using carousels in your communications. Adam Mosseri is the head of Instagram, as we touched on a moment ago, and recently he was explaining why within social environments, why carousels usually do quite well in terms of growing reach, in terms of growing exposure. And he was saying, well, look, firstly, carousels by nature are quite interactive, which algorithms like. But secondly, as it says here, look, if someone sees your post and doesn't swipe, maybe a few days later, your post might appear for them again, but this time it might be the second or third picture shuffled along for that person to interact with. In fact, carousels are so popular and work so well on Instagram that recently it's introduced the ability to make a carousel which can have up to 20 videos or photos in it. Now, like I said, different social networks tend to kind of bring this feature to life in different ways. But I suppose what we're suggesting is look, preferably your content will lead with video, but if you do find video hard to come by, or you haven't quite figured out how to produce it at scale yet, but you can create static imagery, again, you could potentially look at the network you're using and see if there's an opportunity to kind of weave it together in a carousel. One of the other things that they've done recently as well is within the likes of Instagram and even TikTok to a degree, another thing that you can do is you can almost take static images and almost run them as a slideshow and then put music over the top. It would appear that as long as people spend time on the content, as in literally seconds on the content, if they spend time on the content and then preferably interact with the content, this seems to be something that all the major social players are liking. In fact, carousels seem to be doing so well that even in email format nowadays, we're finding that the carousel, even in the likes of, say, Gmail, can work really, really well. So it's not just a social media thing. It seems to be, like I said, a kind of multi-platform content kind of format convention that we're seeing kind of rolling out. When we think about the rise of video certainly has been a big deal over the last couple of years. But like I said, there is still a role for imagery. And again, I think particularly for time-poor academics or even institutions, I think what we're seeing is there is still a place for there is still a place for imagery, but the imagery probably needs to come to life in a carousel, or the imagery perhaps needs to be kind of almost run as like some kind of slideshow with kind of music or audio running over the top. In fact, recently TikTok introduced its own kind of photo offering called Photo Mode a couple of years ago. And with Photo Mode, effectively, people can upload a photo dump of, a dozen or so pictures and then just have music running over the top of it. And again, the images just kind of shuffle through. So the ability to, like we said, engage audiences online nowadays is very much driven and dictated by multimedia, And while video is absolutely in the ascendancy, it would appear that there is still a role for static imagery. And again, in the next module that we'll run in March, we'll talk a little bit about how you can maybe bridge that gap further still. When we think about the changes that have come through in social media over the last, probably 1 to 2 years, it would appear that pretty much every platform nowadays, like we said, is kind of going through this TikTokification process where they all try and catch up with them. Practically speaking, that has a number of different implications. So if we start to begin with how social media has traditionally worked, social networks traditionally have based their kind of algorithms and the way they sort and curate content for people in their feeds. It's traditionally based that on a user's social graph. So in plain language, like if I log into whatever social network I use, in the past, it would basically curate content for me based upon the people and things that I was connected to. Not only that, it would curate things for me on the basis of what my friends had posted or family or things I'd follow had posted, and also how they had been interacted with. So, in other words, whenever you log into a platform, what you've seen traditionally has been a function of your social graph. And there's lots of different factors that go into that. And it will vary from platform to platform as to how those factors are kind of weighted. But I think what is interesting is what we now find with social media is moving away from the idea of this kind of social graph. And instead now we are experiencing what's kind of otherwise referred to as a content graph. So, in other words, you're being served content based on the content you spend time with and you consume and you watch. So, you tend to find nowadays that a lot of the content in your feeds is more interest driven rather than, say, news driven. And again, this is something which we've seen in more recent times, obviously, with the US Fed election playing out. And again, some of the impact of that on obviously social networks. So, nowadays, when you log into any social network, the lion's share of what you're going to see is not based upon the things that you follow or the people that you're connected to, or even possibly sometimes the groups that you're in. What you're going to experience, irrespective of network, is what the platform thinks you're going to enjoy based upon the content you've consumed and spent time with recently. In the major social networks in the West, if you look at obviously the likes of Facebook or Instagram, I think in Facebook now, about half of what a user sees is algorithmically driven by the AI. And in Instagram, I think it can be as high as 60 to 70% driven by AI. So on that basis, like I said, as social media has kind of skewed to kind of be more closely aligned with TikTok, the algorithms that underpin them have also changed and evolved to suit and accommodate. And in fact, if you go and have a look at the different social networks where you frequent. If you look into some of the ranking signals that kind of determine and what go into what you see and why you see it, one of the things that we'll notice nowadays is there's a much bigger role for content appearing in your feed based upon the time that people spend with it. Because if you think about it, the vast majority of social media users are passive. The vast majority of people in social media don't create content and they don't even interact with content. The vast majority of people consume content in their feed, then scroll to the next one, then scroll to the next one, then scroll to the next one. So engagement, as measured by things such as likes, comments, reactions, shares, etc., those behaviors are quite fleeting. The vast majority of engagement in social media is far more passive, and as a result, social networks have shifted to start favoring passive engagement signals more and more, particularly as video has taken over, as the AI is dominating feeds, and as everyone, like I said, looks to follow TikTok's lead. And it's interesting because, from a creation point of view, this brings about a few changes for us. So firstly, we need predominantly multimedia content, ideally video, but if not video, then carousels, or carousels with video in them would be probably even better. But we want people to spend time with the content. And again, we'll talk about how to do that in more detail in module 4 in March. But it also means that in some regards, social network algorithms almost operate a little bit more like, say, Google does, in that with your content, not only do we need people to spend time with it, but to help drive the distribution by the AI, we need to provide more context in our content to drive the distribution and propagation across people's feeds. So nowadays, the role for intelligent copywriting in social media is much, much higher than it used to be in the past. Now, traditionally, for providing a boost in discovery, people have often thought that, oh, well, isn't the key to driving discoverability for my scientific paper? Isn't that just me using the right hashtags? Hashtags do play a role in discovery, but probably not to the extent that people think they do. And there are other things which you can do, which are probably more valuable and more important than the actual hashtags that you supply. Again, Adam Mosseri, the chief of Instagram, discussed this on an Ask Me Anything session a little while ago. And you might be thinking, why do we keep referring back to Adam Mosseri? Well, he's the most open and most transparent social media leader that you can really kind of point to. So again, a lot of the things that he shares can be viewed almost as proxies and bellwethers for other platforms too. So not definitive by any means, but certainly indicative of wider industry trends. So when we think about hashtags, one of the things that Mosseri said is, look, when you look at algorithms that drive distribution and rankings, the hashtags are useful for categorization, but they're not particularly trustworthy in terms of driving rankings because people will kind of often spam with hashtags. And it's interesting because of all the information you can supply in a post, there are other things that you can supply which are probably more beneficial for driving discoverability than probably being overly hung up on the hashtags. In fact, studies suggest that with hashtags, while it is probably useful to use them, and it does vary, to be fair, between networks, but if you do use them, we don't necessarily want to go crazy with the volume of hashtags. And Instagram itself advises about 3 to 5 hashtags for best results, and other independent studies kind of support that figure as well. But the idea is of hashtags, like I said, is by all means, use relevant, appropriate ones if it's suitable for the platform you're using. Like they don't really work so well in Facebook, for example, and lesser and less do they seem to work in LinkedIn too. But certainly within, X or Twitter, Instagram and TikTok, that there seems to be probably a bigger role for them. But one of the things what was concluded from that is, look, if you use a lot of hashtags, if anything, that often comes across as spammy, and if anything, is probably more likely to trigger some kind of shadow ban or penalty. Because let's say, for example, that you're using 20 hashtags, which you just copy and paste onto all your posts. Like, it's not unusual for some reason or other for one of those hashtags to incur a penalty, but that can happen for a range of reasons. And let's say you've used a hashtag that has a penalty on it in your post. Well, you would probably find that you could run the risk of getting shadow banned yourself and having your distribution restricted because you've used a banned hashtag. So I think using a lot of hashtags for probably both an academic or for an institution not only looks a bit kind of low quality, but you also run the risk, I think, of having your control distribution clipped in the event that, one of those hashtags has a penalty or a ban on it. So one of the things that Instagram shared recently is, look, from a discovery point of view, the content itself and the way that people respond to the content is more of a driver of discoverability than the hashtags. And what we've seen as a result of that is nowadays we're starting to see this kind of crossover between social media and search engine optimization. And really now, when you're writing a post, whether it's in, one network or another, there is this move nowadays to write that post not only to communicate and to kind of interest your audience, but also to think about feeding the discoverability of that. And effectively, what we're seeing now is a lot of people are beginning to use social media like search engines. And again, one of the senior bigwigs at Google sort of first broke this a couple of years ago. And they were saying, look, in our studies, 40% of young people, when they're looking for a place to lunch, they don't go to Google Maps or search, they go to TikTok or Instagram. And, that was 2 years ago. So I would argue now that the percentage of young people doing that is probably a lot higher. But not only that, the percentage of young adults using social media for all manner of discovery is also much, much higher than it was at that point in time. So the rise of social search is an interesting one. Now, Google's not going to topple over overnight. There's still obviously, a very, very strong position it holds in the marketplace. But I think it is fair to say that online discovery is changing. So on that basis, when you are crafting your posts, irrespective of where you are putting them, you need to draft the post to go along with the image or the video or the carousel to also drive its discoverability. So what that would sort of mean in practical terms is we want to write your captions so that there is a lot of context signals in them. And as a result, now you're finding that a lot of social media posts run quite long in terms of the character count. And again, like I said, part of this kind of long form copywriting is there to drive the kind of discoverability. As social media and search engine optimization increasingly start to overlap. Now, again, when we look at discoverability, there are variances between different demographics and different kind of cohorts around how and why they use sort of social search. But what we're definitely seeing is irrespective, social networks are making a big move nowadays into the discovery and search space. And as AI takes over the algorithms, this is becoming ever more present and ever more important. So with that in mind, when you are drafting your posts to talk about your projects, to talk about your research, one thing I would suggest is to err on the side of caution and to provide increasing amounts of copy in your posts. Now, when we think about social media caption lengths, social media caption lengths have been sort of creeping upwards for quite a number of years. In fact, a few years ago, HubSpot commissioned a study looking at various different factors. And one of the things they were looking at was engagement rates and caption lengths. Now, social media copywriting traditionally had always been quite short. So, probably 100 to 150 characters was probably the sweet spot for length for a social media caption. Nowadays, it runs much, much longer than that. And again, when we look at different platforms will have different character counts by different placements. But certainly, like I said, a lot of the major players nowadays run really, really long in terms of their caption lengths. So for an Instagram post can be over 2,000 characters. A Facebook post can be really, really long as well. LinkedIn for institutions is probably a bit shorter, but for academics and individuals, it's significantly longer. So I think what I would suggest is, think about your social media post in two parts. You've got the caption, which is there to communicate and explain what you do, and obviously to be interesting and thought-provoking. But also, we want to make sure that we're providing adequate copy and characters, because again, that provides context to go along with the content itself. So even if you're sharing a video or a carousel, I would definitely suggest, dabbling in more longer form copywriting. Now, again, as you potentially draft longer posts, whether you're an individual or an institution, the layout becomes quite important. The formatting becomes quite important. Using things like kind of visual elements or emojis to kind of draw the eye or to kind of, capture people's interest becomes quite important. But again, it might also be worth considering using some of the readability tools out there to make sure that content is digestible. Again, when it comes to obviously engaging your readers or your viewers or your audience, you don't have very long to obviously pique their curiosity. So if you do manage to pique someone's curiosity, but then you bamboozle them and confuse them with industry jargon and, you know, relatable language, that's not going to probably do you too many favors. So there are various different tools that you can use, as we've kind of touched on before. But perhaps what you could do is you could take your posts, pop them into whatever networks, whatever readability tools you like to use, and then get a steer on that content to make it more shareable and make it more digestible. Not only are social networks shifting to become more video led, to favor time spent, to kind of, adopt characteristics of SEO. But one of the other big things is kind of a thematic shift that we've gone through as well. And again, it's all part of this kind of gradual TikTokification, because as we touched upon earlier on, TikTok doesn't identify as a social network. TikTok identifies as an entertainment app. So TikTok would argue that it has more in common with Netflix than it does with anyone else. And I think that's probably quite fair. So on that basis, what we're finding is all social networks now are shifting their algorithms to favor content that sparks positive feelings or enjoyment in their kind of user base and within their audience. If we think about, traditionally how social media has played out, social media in its original construct was very polarizing. And again, you've only got to spend 5 minutes on Twitter, particularly in the last 2 weeks with the US election, to see that kind of tribalism still in full effect. But there's a reason why, hundreds of millions of people have left Twitter in droves over the last 10 years. And that is, it's not a particularly nice place to spend time. And it's increasingly not particularly educational or informative either. Whereas, TikTok is an environment where you can go to learn. It's an environment where things are, educational but accessible. And I think both for creators and for institutions alike, what we have to be thinking about is if we're producing content around any particular area, we need to make sure that content is delivered in an entertaining way. Now, one of the things we discussed in one of our recent Q&A sessions was, what content should I make? How should I produce it? Even if you're making content for LinkedIn, I think it's a good idea to go onto TikTok, have a look at how your niche or your area of expertise comes to life, or even just have a look at how scientific content comes to life on TikTok, and then use that as your blueprint for how you might go about making your content for LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or anyone else for that platform. So I think certainly when we look at delivery, we're definitely finding now that, led by TikTok's kind of example, there's very much this focus now around entertainment first and foremost. And again, this is something which I think probably both institutions and researchers will have to obviously get their head around. How do I make this topic entertaining? How do I cut this video so to maximize kind of retention rates and drive good view completions? In module 4, we'll look at the ingredients in successful content, specifically video content, and give you some practical ways and means and tools of achieving that. But I think we've got to understand that nowadays in social media, it's much more of an entertainment agenda than it is a news agenda. And I think if you are able to create content which whereby you take your topic, whether it could be dentistry or biomechanics or whatever, but if you can take your area of expertise and craft that in such a way that, again, people are glued to it and want to stay with you from start to finish, again, that's what drives the distribution now. So in many ways, again, if we're creating content, we need people to spend time with it. But people are not going to spend time with content that they don't enjoy. So fundamentally now, it's not just a video-driven approach to content marketing. It's an entertainment-driven approach to content marketing that we all need. And like we said, this idea of entertainment really as the driving force. Like I said, it's something which, if you can kind of get your head around it and you can kind of fall in line with it, can be incredibly powerful. Because previously, if you were a scientist or an institution and you only had 150 followers or 2,000 followers, and you wanted to kind of, break beyond that to, a bigger cohort, you simply wouldn't have been able to do it, because previously social algorithms were driven by the social graph, and you could only really reach people that you were connected to by and large. I mean, from time to time things would go viral, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Nowadays, as we've migrated away from the social graph more towards the content graph, which is, like I said, something that TikTok has popularized. Nowadays, even as a scientist or an academic, if you literally have 50 followers, if you can create informative, educational, valuable content that people like to stay with from start to finish, if it's a video, or will go through from front to back if it's a carousel, all of a sudden now you could get a distribution which is orders of magnitude higher. So in a way, the move away from the social graph to the content graph, I think, actually favors experts. But again, we've got to be able to deliver the content in an entertaining way. The migration from the social graph to the content graph, like I said, has had profound consequences. And for platforms, like LinkedIn, like Facebook, like Instagram, like YouTube, like Pinterest, like Netflix, all of these organizations, they're having to adapt to a new climate, a new direction. And this is why, like we said, wherever you are looking to distribute and create content, I think you can learn a huge amount from studying how science comms already comes to life in TikTok. TikTok is the beating heart of creativity on the internet. So if you're struggling for ideas, you're not sure how to bring a subject to life, have a look at how your area or related areas, or even just science, have a look at how science-based comms comes to life in that platform, and that will give you a design blueprint that your content probably wants to look like and would benefit from mimicking. We'll talk more in module 4 about things like video storyboarding and editing and production tools and techniques for research. But between now and March, like I said, there is an absolute wealth of science-based communication already, which is out there, doing very, very well. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So like I said, have TikTok as your North Star for content, at least from a look and feel point of view and a design point of view. And I assure you, even if you're distributing it via LinkedIn or email, you probably won't go too far wrong. And that's it for today. Now, like I said, in module 4, which we'll kick off in March, the module 4 is focused on video from start to finish. So we've got a lot of detail that we'll share on that. I expect also in module 4, we'll also probably talk about using generative AI. There's a wealth of free and very economical generative AI tools that you can use, particularly around kind of multimedia content. So when we have that session in the new year, we'll talk about how to lay out and plan high-performing videos. We'll talk about storyboarding, possibly scripting, and we'll talk about some of the AI tools that you can use to speed up that process and also help you create your videos at scale. So we'll jump now into the Q&A. So just over to you, Alita, if you want to take us in.
Yeah, thanks, James. Suraj can do the Q&A now if you want to run that while we spotlight, if you want us to run that, or we can jump straight into bringing our guests on. Thanks for joining us, Mamita. While we get Rue's in the middle of a conference at the moment, so we're just getting him to start his video, but here we go. But if you could perhaps give us a bit of an introduction to yourself.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Dr. Moumita Khole, and I'm a researcher, a science policy researcher with India's Department of Science and Technology Center for Policy Research, and I'm also a research fellow associated with Research and Research Organization, RORI in UK. So I primarily try to understand how the science funding systems, or how we can effectively do science, what is the need of society, how we can connect science to the society. So those kind of issues is what I work on, and both qualitative and quantitative research. We can discuss this later much detail, so we can hand over to.
Thank you. And hi, Dr. Ru, if you could give us a bit of an intro about yourself.
Hey, thanks, Anita. Hi, I'm Ru Somavira. I'm a principal scientist for quite a large company called Stantec. I'm also an associate professor, adjunct professor here at Murdoch University. And I work with National Geographic as an explorer. So for me, popularizing science, especially shedding light on the not so cute and cuddly things, is what my main social media focus is. I work on reptiles, which is not everyone's favorite group. So I use social media as a platform to shed light on things that we don't normally pay attention to when it comes to wildlife.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start it off just so you have a bit more of a pause, James, with some of the questions in the chat. Renee was asking a question about TikTok. I'm not sure, Ru and Momita, if you're using TikTok at the moment, but she was saying you can add videos without much money to boost your audience, but you've really got no idea where you know who makes up the audience. It seems to be a poor fit for people who'd like to be, reaching a particular audience. It's harder to target your audience. Would you say that's true, James?
Yeah, but I don't think that's unique to TikTok. I think in all social networks, you have two means of distribution, either organic or paid. So, I mean, take for example on LinkedIn, I've got about just under 6,500 followers on LinkedIn. Predominantly, about 40% of them are at senior level, coming from companies like Meta, the ABC in Australia, various universities, banks, so on and so forth. If I do a post on LinkedIn and let's say, for example, I reach 500 people, I've got no idea who those 500 people are. It could be the chief marketing officer at Paramount Pictures, or it could be the intern from Griffith University who's following me. So the challenge with all social media communication is distribution. And if there is a particular audience you want to get in front of, the only way you can assure yourself that it's going to get there is with advertising. So I think, certainly in terms of distribution, I think this is where we see the divergence between probably academics and institutions. Institutions will generally run advertising to make sure they get the right message to the right person at the right time. But for individual scientists, it tends to be more of an organic play. And that's why we were saying earlier on, I think if you do have a particular goal in mind or a particular audience in mind, this is why there is still value in having a website and building an email newsletter distribution list, because then you can very clearly see who is getting your emails and who is not. So we would normally say, look, what networks you're going to use is really determined by who you want to reach. So you may or may not want to use TikTok. But also I think as well, it's determined too by what you like, because there's no point, you thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go and use this network over here, and then being all enthusiastic for 3 months. And then because you hate it or you don't find it interesting, you'll just end up not doing it anyway. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest that any network is perfect. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve for an individual, where you like spending your time. And again, that would really drive your approach. But I still think there's a big role for having a website and an email list as well. So yeah, like I said, there's issues with TikTok, but there's issues with every platform.
Yeah, and keen to get insights from our guests on that, Ru. Perhaps, I think what are your thoughts on do you feel like you're reaching a target audience that you set out to reach? And there was another question in the chat saying, you know, James was talking about the cadence and having to, you know, the amount of content you have to produce, and you know, questions about it doesn't feel like you're you know, it feels like you're sort of feeding the algorithm rather than just creating your content as it's, you know, as it happens. What are your thoughts on that, Roo?
Yeah, and I completely agree with James. So for me personally, so I'm by no means a whiz or a guru in social media. I just science is my thing. I just use social media as a platform to take science to people. So for me, the target audience I have, so I'm not on TikTok, but I also focus largely on LinkedIn and Facebook. So on Facebook, I have about 30,000 following, but some of the engagements are quite low. But part of that is that why I choose LinkedIn and Facebook is also because there's no character limitation, and also I can put external links. So most of my posts, which are science driven, would say like, okay, for more information, here's a recent paper that we did, right? So people can follow up for that thing. And you can't do that in Instagram. So for certain choices, because of the content that the target audience that I want to reach out to, I focus on those two. So you don't have to be across all platforms. You just need to pick what your content and what your targeted audience is. And when you have external links, your engagement and spread is a bit misleading, because a lot of people, instead of reacting to your like putting a like to your post, would actually click that link and go, and hardly anyone would come back to once you read a paper, come back to comment on that, right? So don't take just the number of likes or impressions as the impact, because that depends on quite a lot of other factors too.
Thanks. And how about you, Momita? Is your target more the policy and decision makers? Do you feel that you're reaching them?
Yeah, exactly. So as Ru was mentioning, for a scientist or even the people who are working on the policy aspect sides, we have a very targeted audience. It's not very general. So for me, the best is working with a LinkedIn, because again, you can make a longer post, you can put the links to it, and even sometimes I use the carousels as well to create a snippets of the paper that I have done, that these are my insights. Another thing that I use also very frequently is Twitter, because again, this is a space where the people that I want to target is still in Twitter. And many of them, actually, there is two ways now. The people in my community of researchers has moved to Mastodon because of various reasons that we don't like Twitter. Whereas still the policymakers and those people are still, of course, on Twitter, and they will be on Twitter. So we need to actually now target both this, because one is very niche audience where we want to discuss our findings, whereas the other what we want to convey to the policymakers. And in Twitter, for example, making threads works quite well for many of us, where we put threads and we convey the very important findings. So again, these are the targeted strategy we use. But again, I have to say that for scientists and people like us, it's a very different strategy. And again, I don't know anyone using TikTok yet. So I guess we're still far away from using TikTok.
Momita, I had a quick question. When you were mentioning the carousels that you make on LinkedIn, that's a really probably quite an engaging, quite captivating way of sharing your subjects. Are there particular tools that you use to help with that? And I was also curious as well for both of you to pick up on a question, Alita, that you touched on previously, how you manage your workload, like, because obviously, you know, you're both very busy and, you know, got lots of other things that, you know, you're kind of engaged with. So, you know, because to make those kind of carousels that you've described, you know, firstly, what tools do you use to do that? Because again, there might be other scientists that might find them useful. And like, is that something you put much planning into and scheduling? Like, how do you, you know, produce content at scale?
Let me go then first. The first thing is that, again, honestly, we are no experts in social media content creator. And as an individual, there's a lot of work. If there some institute, like even we had some points, some people to handle the social media content creation, but currently we don't have anyone. But whereas as an individual perspective, I actually use Canva because that's what I know how to make it, and I'm kind of quickly can do that there. And then of course there are little strategy that, okay, I have a paper which I usually put first on the preprint, even if it is even before it gets published, and then kind of do a targeted kind of social media engagement. And again, this is very niche audience, and then that is the point where I do a LinkedIn post. Sometimes also, if I have time to make the carousel, then I do that as well, and put some the post in maybe in Twitter. What are the findings? So this is kind of a strategy I use. Again, there is hardly much time to explore beyond what I'm currently doing, because I think that video content would be a very interesting way of engaging, specifically for scientists when they have very interesting finding. And I can clearly see for Ru's case, there are so much to explore there. But yeah, we have not done anything of that sort just because we don't have time. But these are very important tool that we can engage with larger audience.
And Canva's a great product because there's a free version of Canva which
I have the subscription of the subscribed version because this gives you a little bit age over it, for example, background remover and all. But the free version is also good enough for the beginners.
Brilliant.
We have one person with their hand raised. I'm sorry, I'm probably not going to get your name correct. Ayodeji, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. That was a wonderful attempt. It's Ayodeji Bakari. Thank you very much for the session. I appreciate the time and all that has been said. I would like to ask, I am a social media health content creator. I'm a medical doctor and a pediatrician, and I put out health content basically in a bit of a storytelling format. I have some what you can call a small health series where I play two roles, the doctor and this guy Kuli Olufofo, who comes with gist about things that are happening in his community as touching health, and then the doctor basically corrects, certain implications. Now, my concern is this: do social media algorithms frown at reposting the same video content at a later date, especially if you think the video didn't get as much traction? Because the point of what I do is to educate the public. So if I do not see myself reaching the public, then it defeats what I've done. And I'm sure that there are videos that I've done that will always be relevant again and again. In my practice, I encounter situations that show me that, well, this video you did back then, there are so many more people that need to see it again. So I need to know if the algorithms frown at that. And then I got frustrated with TikTok. I started out on TikTok sometime last year. And then somehow in some past months, they banned my account for violating community guidelines. No explanation. I still don't understand what exactly the issue was because I was putting out verifiable information. So I'm not sure where I erred with them. And I just told myself, I don't think I want to go back to try at TikTok because it was really frustrating to have a whole year of a lot of content and then they just suddenly shut me out for reasons that were not clear. So I just would like to know, because currently there are some videos I've prepared before that I really want to put out again. Because so I'm wondering, do I have to go and reshoot all over again to make it different, or can I reuse the same videos and the algorithm won't have issues with that? Thank you.
That's a really good question. It's not unusual for publishers and broadcasters like news media to reshare their best articles and their most popular articles. So if you have a look at like the New York Times or even the BBC or the Economist, they will regularly reshare the same content. What I would suggest is have a look at your results. So let's say, for example, you've shared a video 3 months ago, and let's say you achieved a certain level of results. when you post it again, just have a look at the results again. And if the results seem to be in line with what you would normally get, then we would conclude from that that there isn't a penalty that you're experiencing. Another option that you could do is when you make your content, sometimes people will make it in multiple formats. So rather than making one video, I make a video, but then I edit it or cut it using an app like CapCut or even Canva. I might make 3 cuts or edits of that, which are slightly different durations. So if we sort of record one scene as you've described it, and I quite like the scene that you described, by the way. I think that kind of myth busting approach is good. So what I would suggest is when you make that, maybe use an app like CapCut, which is free to download, or Canva, and maybe make a couple of different versions of different duration. So a slightly longer one and a slightly shorter one. And what you could then do is you could then kind of re-release them. There are also apps out there that you can use for repurposing content as well, where you can take long form videos and cut them down to shorter ones. So I would say, in terms of, do algorithms penalize you for reposting assets? Not necessarily. But again, let your data sort of really be the conclusive sort of point there. But ultimately, maybe when you are making your video, maybe I would consider making multiple cuts and edits of different durations. And then again, that gives you a few different things that you could share over time, perhaps.
Thank you.
Have you had that happen, Roo, where you have some great content to share, and sharing it once must sometimes seem like a lot of effort for one shot?
It's definitely something I've wondered. I haven't personally experienced that, but when it comes, so my work is largely in the field with animals in remote areas, and one thing I find personally, and this is just a personal experience, is that I get more engagement when it's a rough cut and when I am actually in the footage. So instead of a polished one saying, okay, this animal is doing something cool where the animal is the thing, if a person is there explaining, right? Oh, I'm in this outback place, blah, blah, blah. Here's a very cool animal. Let's learn about it. I noticed that that's more, my understanding is that when I talk to some of the people who have seen that, it's more relatable. You feel like, oh, you are there, like you are being taught, rather than I'm watching National Geographic Channel, right? So it's more relatable. So I think video content, again, it depends on obviously your field, but for any environmental related stuff, outdoor wildlife related stuff, which is my field, I personally have noticed that there's more engagement, there's more sharing, there's more comments, there's engagement in a way when there's someone in the footage rather than the subject alone, and when it's a much more rough cut, which looks like, okay, this is happening, I'm actually there experiencing it, kind of a thing. That is my limited experience in that field.
I would say, Roo, that's actually something that we see across categories, even in a range of more corporate-y settings.
Right.
What we actually see now, because we do quite a lot of benchmarking and auditing across industries for different organizations, and you've perfectly encapsulated, I think, 2 things that would be very broadly applicable for everyone viewing today. The first one is that personality-led content always outperforms. So now we always want to lead with people, not things, or organizations. So a personality-led approach always outperforms. And secondly, it appears, and again, there's I've seen firsthand significant amount of data in kind of client work that we've been involved in, where the more polished the videos are, the worse they do. So it's fascinating, because I dare say there's probably quite a few people who've joined us today who would like to do more with video, but are sort of perhaps put off by the potential resourcing requirement and even the perceived expense of producing video. But actually, if anything, I would argue nowadays, probably the more you spend on it, the worse it will probably do in terms of production. So I think to me, it's great that you've seen that in your own work. But it's also, I think, a really good message to end the session on today. and that is that, you know, personality-led content outperforms. And again, you don't need Steven Spielberg on the cut and edit. You know, the more earthy, the more relatable it feels, the better it commonly does. And Momita, have you discovered anything similar in your experiences?
Sorry, actually, I hardly have created videos because the kind of work we do is a bit different. So, but it's making me also kind of motivated to do some more videos. But that's why I would not have that insights on how video content works. So sorry about that.
Have we got time for one more, or should we wrap it up?
Unfortunately, I've got to jump out for another call right now, unfortunately. But
Okay,
there is any
unfortunately, we
questions, I'll be
haven't
happy to take them on LinkedIn.
been able to get to you, Kevin, but yeah, but we'll put, we've got James's LinkedIn and everyone's LinkedIn profiles in the chat. So if you have any questions, I'm sure they would be fine if you direct message them or send a message to myself. But I just wanted to thank James, Momita and Ru for joining us today. You know, it was a real pleasure having you and hearing your insights. We could have talked for a lot longer. But just to let everyone on the call know that we will be sharing the recording and the slides will be available. And if you sign up to our mailing list for the newsletter, we will let you know when the sessions start off again next year. But thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you in 2025.
Thanks everyone. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.